Good morning, everybody. First question is, who reads comics? That's more than I was actually thinking, actually. Normally, nobody reads comics. And when you hear the term research comics, like, what do you think about? What excites you, or what do you think is like might be problematic about that? Has anybody got any thoughts? Yes.
Accessibility. It has a negative and a positive.
Yeah, so what would be the negative?
The well, looking at some of the examples here, representation, if you're using human character,
Yeah.
but also it makes it more accessible in terms of people that have problems reading, access to academic terminology, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is something that I've tried to tackle is how to represent people of different ethnicities, different religions, just totally different parts of the world that you might not be completely familiar with. How do you do that? Um, any other thoughts? Like what excites people when they think about the term research comics? Or think, oh, that's something I'm interested in. Like why did you come along today? Yes.
For me, what excites me is the idea of storytelling through kind of big pictures.
Yeah.
We work with people with learning disabilities, so we're really interested in this
Okay.
topic from that perspective.
Fabulous.
I guess my main worry about comics is the idea of how you read them and kind of people not necessarily knowing how to read left to right and up and down, if it's a speech bubble or all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the layout of the panels and how to make sure that it's coherent. That's it. Yeah, that's definitely if you if you work with an artist who's not familiar with comics and how to lay out the page, it can be really incongruent. So I thought I'd just start by asking like a little bit about why people are here today. Because some people are really familiar with comics, some people have no idea like what they have to do with research. It's quite a new concept for some people. So I'm from a Monash University in Australia, and this is not just to like boast the comics that I've done. It's just trying to show my credentials. These are some of the comics that I've created with disaster affected peoples and artists. So I have kind of experience in creating comics. I do not draw. I'm really bad at drawing. I write the scripts, and the artist has the skills to bring it to life. So nobody here is expected to be good at drawing. We're going to have a go at creating comics today, but you're not learning how to draw. You're learning how to think visually. That's what we're looking at today. We're thinking about how can you take your research or a different context, maybe it's not your research, and how to create that, how to represent that visually, how to turn it into a visual story. So, these are some. Oop, that's not working. And you go on here. Here we go. So these are other academic pieces of work that have been turned into like graphic novels. A lot of that work is in history and medical anthropology. It's really, really popular comics. So there is a precedent of like research in different disciplines, particularly history, anthropology, doing this type of work for the very reasons that you were saying before to try and increase accessibility. So some of the reasons that people want to create comics is, it's for increasing accessibility, reaching beyond academic audiences. So my comics, they've allowed me to be invited to speak at COP28, which is like the Conference of Parties, the big climate change conference every year. It's been able to reach into different schools, high schools, teachers have used them, and to be able to give the findings back to the research communities as well as different policymakers. So it's just a way of speaking beyond complicated academic articles that which are really impenetrable for people outside of academia. They can also, there's a lot of literature that says that comics can foster empathy, which can, motivate people to act on certain issues that are represented in comics. They can make research more participatory. You can write the comics with the people in your research, which is one of the things that I did in my first comic. And they're also just really fun. So, you know, academics, you spend a lot of time in our rooms on our own writing, so they can be a really fun way to get outside of your office and work with people in really fun ways. So today, like I said, we're not learning how to draw, we're learning how to think visually. So this is kind of the layout of today. I'll be going through the first half. It's kind of like it's me talking at you, I'm afraid, with some questions, but it's trying to give you a grounding in the key conventions and the language of comics. And within that, embedded is kind of me advocating for why it's a really great way to translate your research. So try and take note of that different conventions and the language of comics, because in the second half, we're going to have a little go at trying to create our own one-page comic. Again, you're going to be thinking through when I'm talking today, think about a key moment or a finding from your research or something you've read about, maybe you've not done your field work yet, or something in your own personal life. If maybe you're not doing research at the minute, think about something that you would like to try and visualize in a one-page comic. And maybe that'll become clearer as I talk. And then we'll have a go, writing the script, sketching out one page, and then we'll have a little talk together. Okay, so the workshop as well today is based on this article that I wrote recently, How to Translate Research into Comic, based on disaster scholarship, which is for Ksenia's Journal of Disaster Studies. So in that, it's like I basically wrote a guide on how to create comics, because a lot of people want to create comics in research now, but they just don't know how to do it. There's a lot of literature about, you know, the representational practices and the politics of comics, but not really on like how do you do it. So I tried to create like a bit of a friendly how-to guide and to help people along who wanted to do it. Okay. So this is now the whistle-stop tour of like comic conventions and languages, which you can integrate in your comic page at the second half of the class of the workshop. Key thing with comics is, which I think is really exciting, is that they really center everyday experiences. The culture of comics is often to center on everyday, banal, daily life. So this allows your reader to go to places in your research that they might never see, that they might have never seen on the news, or they might have never seen a photograph of, because you can't access them with audiovisual material. So say if you're doing methods with photographs or video cameras, you're not going to access everywhere, you're not going to access all moments. And the media is not going to access all the moments in your research that are possible. So for example, this image here was based off my research after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And after that, you found that families were living temporarily with other members of family in the neighborhood, sleeping on the floor in the living room. Two women I spoke to told me, you know, because we're sleeping in the living room of my family members, we're not allowed to, we can't be sexually intimate. There is no way that you're going to be able to access that through through visually, but comics allow you to visit and see that moment, which is a very private moment. So here I've just got some prompts in all the slides that you'd be thinking about. Is there any moments in your own research that you never hear about or you never get to see that you could bring to life in a comic? A second thing is that comics really focus on first person narratives about daily life. And the beauty of that is you get to distill and to understand really complex ideas that you might not be able to understand. You might need to read a whole chapter in a book to understand, but comics can distill that through everyday life. So this image here, this is about post-disaster Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico imports 85% of its food and materials. It's a small island. After the disaster, all of that stopped for like several weeks. Because there was less being imported, local prices in the shops increased. Because there was less to sell, so shopkeepers increased their prices. So people, you know, they couldn't afford to like buy routine items in the supermarket. That's a really complicated thing. It's about like international trade, political economy, but you can kind of understand that through this vignette of a woman going to the shop, and you have like a a thought bubble of like the port. It's not having all the details, but it doesn't matter in a comic. You don't have to have everything in there because the reader fills in the gaps basically. To drive the story, if you don't want to have it as like a first person narrative from a research participant, you could integrate yourself as a character in the comic. To be honest, I would kind of shy away from that because it's kind of centering you, the researcher, within the story. It's kind of just framing this experience of your research participant around maybe your tale or your adventure. So I think for me personally, I think it's better to remove yourself and to center on the experiences or the lived experience of those in your research. Another thing that's really, really interesting with comics is that they're really playful with time scales and temporalities. So you can go really, really quickly, you can move really, really quickly in a comic. So here you can move from like 1492 to 2018. You could move from the Industrial Revolution in panel 1, box 1, all the way down to the impacts of climate change in the Caribbean in panel 6. You can move really fast. You can cover a lot of ground. Or you can move really, really slowly. You could dwell on a moment that of a research participant's experience that you think is really important for the reader to understand, to really dwell on that moment. So in one of the comics I created, there's a moment where a mother's just sitting on a couch. You know, she's exhausted from like a lot of the labor she's had to. A lot of like domestic duties become more difficult post disaster. Cooking and cleaning and childcare become more difficult in a post disaster situation. She just sat there thinking about that, taking a moment to just relax. That was like multiple panels, and I wanted to dwell on that moment because it was trying to spotlight the emotional and physical labor of women in post disaster contexts. So that's something you can really play around with in comics, is like speed. You can also, the second point, visualize people's past histories, or you can visualize people's aspirations for the future. Now, the interesting thing about that is, if I'm taking from my own research in disasters, so I do a lot of research in with communities affected by disasters, is that if you think about the media and when you watch the news about disasters, you never really hear a lot about who these people are. You know, there's past stories, their personalities, their lived histories. Like, where did they come from? You just see images of them, raw suffering. Maybe their house has been destroyed by an earthquake or a typhoon. Very little about who they are. But if you get to see their past histories in like maybe a thought bubble, you get to see that they are people with multiple temporalities. They've got a lived history. They also have aspirations and dreams for the future. So they're future-oriented agents. So it's a really great way to develop a complex understanding of the people in your research, whoever they may be. A third bit, I think this is really exciting thing about comics, is that you can visually create like critical commentaries about what the world should look like. So think about your own research now. I got what this other question is about. Have you come to some sort of conclusion or tentative ideas about what you think the world should look like or could look like, whatever you may be researching, and you can literally bring that to life in a comic. So this one here, this reconstruction after the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017, loads of comic artists, they started drawing what they thought reconstruction looked like, what they thought the island should look like. They were saying we need to have political and economic independence from the United States because they're fundamentally a colony. We need to have more food sovereignty. We need to start growing native vegetables because that will increase our resilience. We need to be, start to be learning our native languages and developing our traditional religions. And so that was all part of how they thought recovery should look like. That wasn't happening in this, so-called real world. It wasn't happening. It's quite, far removed what's happening in Puerto Rico, but they were able to make a critical commentary like this should be happening. Just as you would in a journal article, you write normative ideas about what the world should look like. You can bring it to life in a comic. Just as pause though, is there anybody here who's sort of working on research and they've come to some sort of conclusion about what the world should look like, or what the world, or any policies or programs that they think should be developed to improve conditions in whatever research context you're exploring? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my research is mostly about how everyone can be kind of innovative in coming up with alternatives for the way that we are meeting our needs today, and how that could be more sustainable. And I think it's really centered on the way that another future, an alternative future, that everybody is kind of innovative and has this critical thinking about the way that their needs are met, and how they can come up with a more sustainable alternative for that.
And if you were to like, and maybe you don't have the answer now, but is there some sort of I know policy or program you think could or should be developed to just to kind of support that?
At the moment, I'm at this point in my research that I'm thinking maybe what people need at this point is actually narratives. And that's why I find this really interesting, because I think like the only thing that people need to be kind of like empowered, although empowered is not really a correct term for that, is actually to see narratives of other people that have done it and are successful doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like there are tons of frameworks and tools and toolkits out there, but I think what kind of like makes that possible is to spread the word through narratives, and probably visual narratives.
But there are examples of where it's worked, you're saying.
Yeah.
So that's something you could bring into the comic. So you could I see. So I mean, that's kind of one of the great things with comics is they can be very normative. They can be like a visual guide of what the world could and should look like. So they're very playful in that way. They allow you to, unshackle yourself from like the constraints of what the world is, to what the world could be. Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts on like the research and what they've got? Critical comment, yes, please.
Mine's that I'm not a researcher. I do not have a PhD. I admire anybody that takes that up, because concentrating on one thing for that length of time with my ADHD brain is something I aspire to. I'm a librarian, but I see that there is need for change in the way that we support students.
Yeah.
And there could be a framework that is developed, a policy that is developed, and a kind of a narrative structure on how these things may benefit both staff and students. I can see that fitting into something like this.
Yeah, instead of writing it, it's like a report on like, this is what we could do. You could show this is what would happen.
Yes.
If we were to put in place certain.
The last thing that students need, particularly postgraduate students, is something else to read.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even policymakers, it's not just like a student, it's policymakers. So at the minute we're developing a small comic for policymakers in the Philippines, because I've written reports before and they're just like so time poor.
Yeah.
So I thought, let's experiment now with a comic which still has a bit of text, but visualizes policy recommendations based off research. I'll see how that goes, but I don't know. I've never used policymakers in that fashion. Okay, what else? So we have here again. This is all top front loaded information for you going and doing your own comics. Key thing is language, like the conventions in terms of like what do you put on the page when you do a comic. You're probably all familiar with these boxes. They're called panels. Captions are like the box with text. Captions are normally a narrator who drives the story. That could be a person in your research. So the narrator was this woman in one comic. it could be another character in the comic who is not the main person. It could be a neighbor, another family member, could even be an animal. They drive the story forward, guiding the reader, filling in some of the gaps that the dialogue can't and the images can't. Or it could be a completely third person narration. It could be somebody, it could be yourself who's not even in that context, or an anonymous narrator. You've got gutters, which are just to separate the panels. And then you've got these like really cool things called word balloons and emanata. So emanata are like shorthand symbols to show emotion or sensation. So like if you're at the top here, if you're happy or sleeping, and all different types of emotions. And then you have word balloons, which again, it's to try and represent sound or smells. Now, you might, when you're doing your research, you might not be thinking so much about the sounds and the smells and tastes in your research context. And to be honest, I've never thought about that doing research in post-disaster context. But when I was working with an illustrator, he said to me, when I gave him a draft script, he said, well, what does it smell like there? What does it sound like? What are the tastes? And I was like, I have no idea. So when I went back, I asked those questions because the illustrator needs all that context. They need to know about emotions and smells and sounds to make it a convincing world. So when I went back to Puerto Rico, I started asking people, what are the sounds here? And when I asked that question, women started telling me about petrol generators. There was no electricity, so everybody started buying petrol generators, and the noise, it was unbelievable. And then the women started saying, it's so bad for my well-being. It's one of the most difficult things post-disaster. So that prompt by the illustrator opened up a whole avenue of different types of things to think about in my research. So again, be thinking about that, like other smells, sounds, tastes in your own research, or what you might think about drawing that you maybe haven't thought about, but could be important, or that are in your research and you can bring to life in a comic. And again, you can't say you're doing a video or a photograph, you can't show the sensation or the emotion or the intensity of smells and sounds in the way that you can in a comic. Okay, yes. Yes, please do.
Emanata, it's the first time I've heard that word. Is there like a consistent kind of way of representing these things then? So, is there a language in that sense that people that draw comics
Yeah,
use?
I would say so, but I wouldn't know the whole inventory of them.
Yeah.
But these sort of things like sweating, perspiration, some of them are fundamental that are universal.
Particularly the idea of the idea, the concept, the representation of an idea as a light bulb, which is so common, isn't it, in our culture?
Yeah.
Now, we found that was quite problematic with our group. They didn't necessarily associate the light bulb with thinking. It was a light bulb.
Yeah.
So it could be really confusing,
Right.
which is why I asked the question about whether or not there is this sort of established way of representing things in the comic world.
Yes.
Exactly. As a librarian, that is a really good book. I'm trying to find it now. I think it's Scott McCloud, but I can't remember.
Oh, yeah,
The
yeah.
author writes how to create. Yeah.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, I'll find the reference.
Thank you.
Please do.
Really helpful.
I can't answer that about the light bulbs.
Yeah, it's just a
because,
thought.
I don't use that, but that would make sense if there's some symbols mean different things in different cultures.
It's a metaphor, isn't it? The light bulb is the idea of thought.
Yeah, I'll avoid using a light bulb.
No, it's just a thought.
Okay, moving on, because we only have an hour. We've got to create a whole comic, so everybody's got to get ready. Get your thinking caps on right now, because we're gonna go into drawing very soon. I use the term drawing very loosely, by the way. I mean like stick figures. I'm not expecting anybody to be an artist. Okay, so another thing with comics, a disclaimer: you cannot put everything in a comic. There's no way. Say you're doing a PhD, that comes out at about 80,000 words, give or take. You're not going to be able to put that much information into a visual story, but nobody's expecting you to do that with a comic. You have to make shrewd decisions about what to keep in and what to leave out. You need to think, maybe there's some prior knowledge here in the audience, or you can assume some prior knowledge, or maybe you just think that's not important. There are some findings that I'm more interested in communicating. You also have to rely on the reader's understanding of the world, of concepts to fill in the gaps. So this is an example here. I did a collaboration with a researcher in Cape Town about a flood about a drought in Cape Town. Basically, one of the findings was that a lot of the water infrastructure was bursting, and during a drought, that's really problematic because the cost of water was really high. So if there's a burst pipe, you want it to be fixed quickly. What they found was that the pipes would burst in across the city, but they would be not fixed as quickly in the Black communities. So there's this inequality of access to like infrastructure being fixed, so that Black families were paying more, the water bills were higher. And you see the woman here, you can say, like, basically the last line is her saying, I bet they don't have these problems in the white communities where the white people live. There's no word here. We're not talking about segregation here. There's no touching on segregation in this comic, but we can kind of assume the reader has some understanding of South Africa and racial segregation, and they can fill in the gaps there, because you don't have enough pages to like talk about racial segregation or apartheid history in South Africa. So again, think about in your own research, like where would there be prior knowledge? Where do you think people would already know, have a little bit of understanding about the world? All right, a couple more slides. People say, like, how do you identify what to communicate in a comic? So, excuse me. Basically, do you want to communicate one participant's experience, or do you want to consolidate multiple participants' experiences into one story? That's what I tend to do in my comics, is you take from all of the participants as like, what are the commonalities and threads? Kind of what you would do in a journal article, and you consolidate that to an individual. So, but that that individual character is obviously not representing all of the participants. So you're still making decisions. So for example, this research here about landslides in Bolivia, what I found was that in this neighborhood in Bolivia, a lot of low-income families, they would have typically a woman would go to live in Argentina or Spain and send home remittances that they would invest in the house to build a stronger house. Not all families have that. Maybe like 30% of houses had somebody go overseas and send remittances. And then of those 30%, a lot of them were mothers, and they had children, and they would leave the children with the grandmother or the grandparents. Right? Again, that was maybe, 10% of the sample. Small, right? Not all of them. But I decided I wanted to focus on that particular experience because I wanted to spotlight Indigenous experiences, mothers' experiences of like distance from their children, like that emotional labor, the experience of migration and the importance of migration. It's not the most common experience, but I wanted to spotlight that. So you can be thinking about in your own research, whose story do you want to tell? What experience is marginalized in the literature and you want to bring to the front in the comic? Okay, so just penultimate one. Another thing I get asked is, how are you creating a comic about something that you never saw? You weren't even in the room when that happened. And it's a combination of using lots of data, your interviews or your observations or your photographs and videos, etc., and then bringing in creative license. So this is what's termed in comic studies graphic truth, or the truth fiction spectrum. You're not trying to represent objective reality. You're trying to allow people to see the truth. in the schematic representation of findings. So this example here, this is a research in Barbuda after a big hurricane in 2017. I was told that if maybe I entered like 20 people, in about 7 of those, the parents said, my kids are really scared when it rains. They get like kind of really anxious when it rains now because there might be another hurricane. I was not in the room when this happened, but this photo, this bedroom is a photo I took, so I know a bedroom looks like that. I know that men, there was like a local bar that the fishermen would hang out and chat. Like some of the people that told me, 2 fishermen, they told me that. So I'm using creative license there to say that they talked about this during the time at the bar, and that the children said, Mom, Dad, that didn't actually happen like that. I don't know, but you're using that creative license. So think about that again in your own research, like how much data do you have, but will we have to bring in creative license? Any questions about that? All right. Okay, last slide. So writing the script. So this is kind of what you'll be having a go at now. With very low expectations, like I said, nobody has to be an artist. This is how I tend to write the scripts. You kind of break it down into chunks. So this is just 1 page, right? And I tend to think, what is the one finding or one moment in the research that I want to represent on this page? That's how my brain works. Like 1 page, 1 finding. It's just it's too much otherwise. It's just clear for me. And then you break it down into panels, typically about 6 to 8 panels. And then you try and think about what is happening in each panel and how, as a combination, they tell that key finding. So you can see here, this page was all about how, like I explained before, after disasters, without electricity, women's domestic duties become more time and labour intensive. You have to go to the shops every day because there's no fridge. Cleaning by hand, cooking on a little stove, just like, a little cumbersome stove. And she couldn't open up her cake business because there's no electricity to run all the appliances. So that's what I would suggest. It's just breaking it down into chunks, just to make it a bit more manageable. So we've got over halfway already. It's gone really quick. Before we crack on to do have a go at creating your own comic, has anybody got questions about what we just covered there, the conventions? Yes.
Just have one question. If it's off topic, we can like leave it for after. So who are the main audience of these comics? Because I'm just thinking, like, I come from design background, and for designers, it's so even for design researchers, probably they're okay with like reading comics and so on. But is it like in research community, for instance, they're not gonna be taken seriously, or you know what I mean? Like some people just think it's too fun to be true, or
no, I would say the comics are really welcome now. They're seen as like legitimate forms of academic translation. When I did the first comic in 2019, it was a bit. I tried to get funding from the university, and they were like, "Oh, this is a bit unusual." But now universities they will give internal funding for it. So in the academic community, 100% they're seen as legitimate ways to communicate your research. Even an NGO, a recovery NGO working in the Philippines, use one of the comics to facilitate conversation within a community in a post-disaster situation. So they can be used in those sorts of contexts. The main way that I've used them is in high schools. So they've been printed and given to high school educators, and they use them in geography typically. And that's, in the UK and Australia, but even individual academics have used them. Like, I mean, I hate to gloat, but it's like in over 25 countries they've been used for teaching. So there is a real appetite for using comics in the classroom too. So I wouldn't worry so much about that. They are seen as legitimate research output. Yes, please.
I think we talked a lot about like the benefits and also like the things that comics can tell that research can't, but is there also limitations from your experience with using comics?
Yeah, I think the accessibility thing. I remember somebody said, well, people who maybe you're visually impaired, you can't read them. I think also the culture of comics seen as being like silly and childlike and being associated with superheroes maybe puts people on the back foot a little bit. That's why I'm curious of giving them into policymakers to see what they make of them. But I think you can get around that by the type of illustrator you work with, because depends on their style. Some might be a bit more realistic, and some might be more like cartoonish. So I think that does make a difference. Yes, please.
Sorry, can you speak about the logistics then of how do you go from your like A4 page? I'm not saying it's not fantastically, put together, but how do you go from that to your, this comic book? Do you sit in the room while this happens, or does the illustrator crack on?
Yeah.
Fire draft? How does that work?
Okay, I'll show you really quick because I thought you might ask this. So these slides at the end of the presentation. This is like the format of what happens. I decide what findings to communicate. I mean, it's totally straightforward. Like, I'll write the script. We're not going to write a really intense script today, but it's really detailed typically. I mean, it's super detailed. Like, it's like that. I mean, this is 3 panels, because if you're working with an illustrator who's not from that context, they're like, what is this? You need to give lots of input. Even if you are working with an illustrator from that context, you still got to have a lot of input. So anyway, you write a script. The illustrator roughly sketches it, stick figures kind of thing. Comes back to the authors. I would speak to people in your research. What do you think about this? Have we missed anything? Is the dialogue okay? Does it look okay? Make any tweaks, like give feedback to the illustrator. Then they ink it, the final version. You have some minor edits, and then it's finally inked. So it's like a back and forth process. If you like, for the one that I did in Puerto Rico, I went there 5 times to the country, and every time I would go back with 4 new pages from the comic, and I'd sit with the families and get feedback. So that's a slower process, obviously. But if you're not having that consultation every time, it can be super quick. If you're working with an illustrator who has loads of experience with comics, and they're from that context, and they're kind of familiar with the topic, you probably don't need to give as much information as this. You could probably give like the finding that you want to communicate and just less information, and they can probably rely on their own local knowledge and understanding. And that's what I'm doing at the minute. I'm working with 2 local artists in the Philippines. They're from that context. They've lived through these disasters, and it's less script. They kind of get it, basically. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
I've got one. I definitely will not get funding through my role to do something like this.
Yeah.
Just wondering what your feelings are on using AI to generate images in that context. I have thoughts, but what would be your thoughts on that?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I got a comic sent to me recently by a researcher who said, "Oh, I've read your comic. I've created this comic," and it was an academic in dentistry. So first of all, I don't know why this doesn't mean they don't know anything about teeth. But it said, "What do you think about my comic?" And I could tell it was AI generated straight away. I mean, AI is going to get amazing, so maybe it's just because it's the first round of it. But from what I saw from that, it didn't have it wasn't maybe able to capture the nuanced context of where they were trying to do the research, or I mean, with a comic, you still need to have really strong understanding of the context, because you're trying to create these convincing worlds. That's what you're doing. You're creating convincing worlds where a person reads it and they go, "Oh yeah, I know exactly where that is," right? Maybe AI isn't that sophisticated yet to be able to get that much detail. Like even the trees, the leaves, or like the bird can, as somebody reads it, I know exactly where that is. But I don't know, AI, It's probably gonna happen, it's gonna happen, isn't it? Yeah, it is.
But I will definitely, there is no way that the library will fund me to draw comics or employ somebody to draw. So,
We never know, we never know. Does anyone want to have a little go at sketching one-page comic? We've only got 20 minutes now, but we can probably, you never know, we could create something amazing and we can publish together and make £1,000. It could be happening right here. What I thought you could do is, have you all been having a little think there about a moment or a finding in your research that you would like to bring to life? Maybe try not to even overthink it. Maybe it's like a moment when you met somebody in your research and you just said hello. What was that encounter like? You know, maybe you could draw yourself, like even traveling to where you're doing research and you're thinking about the research, maybe a bit anxious about it. You know, maybe it could be a moment when you sat, you know, doing an interview, or maybe it's something you observe. I think like a very like brief moment, whatever that may be. Has everybody got something in mind? I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay. For this bit, so we skipped on from that page. Just try and lay out like 6 panels, 6 boxes, right? And how would you break up that moment? So, how would you break up that one finding into 6 moments? I remember you can play with time. Maybe you're jumping a whole day, maybe you're jumping a whole week, maybe it's a whole second. So it doesn't have to make complete sense in terms of time wise. People will get it when they read the comic. You could even have captions that says 2 p.m. or the date or anything like that. So try and write the script, just one sentence, what will happen in each panel. Thinking about what's the first image the reader will see. Is there some sort of dialogue or like emanata, like sounds that would be useful? And maybe there's thought bubbles, and you can use captions as well. And make sure what kind of detail would you need to put in the image so that they know exactly where it is. So if you're doing research, I don't know, in Liverpool, you see the live bird building in the background. That's perhaps you wouldn't have to be that obvious. So if you take, we'll take 7 minutes because we don't have much time now, and just really briefly sketch it out. 6 panels and a sentence for each panel. And remember, you could pick something, a moment where that you think people never get to see, that you think is important. It's an opportunity to visualize something you think is important. Yeah, we just say it doesn't even have to be people speaking. You can have objects speaking. You can have animals speaking. You know, what's their perspective or something. All right. So just planning what's going to be in the panels, and then we can have a go at sketching them, even with like stick figures. All right, I can see that quite a few people have already started drawing, so we can probably just continue. I just wanted to show you this really quickly. Is that, oh, where's it gone? No, it's not there. Anyway, I was trying to show you an image that I sketched, which was really bad, but this is basically what the artist drew. That's how simple it is. It could be just stick figures. That's what we're looking for in your sketch now, or even more basic. So it doesn't have to be really, really good. Because again, you're not learning how to draw, you're just learning how to think visually, how to communicate an idea visually. And even if you find it difficult, that's fine. It's the first time you're doing it. We can talk about that afterwards. So in the third part, have a go at sketching your page. Okay. Using, you know, simple things like stick figures and boxes, but as long as you can see what the fundamental components of what's meant to be in that panel, where the speech bubble would be, where the caption would be, where the person standing. All right, we're kind of coming to the end of our time here. I can see some like really amazing, that's really good.
Amazing, no,
I mean, not amazing, but isn't it?
choose words.
It's on 6 out of 10. Okay, I know that was a really quick introduction to how to draw comics, but how did you find that? Like, what was one of the most challenging things to do there? Like in trying to create that, trying to sketch out that page. What did you find one of the most difficult things?
Sequencing.
Sequencing, in what sense?
What background information you need to actually make the point, and where does that go? So do you do it as, say, oh God, I can't think of the word, flashback? Or do you know, how do you sequence that to make it visually interesting, but also making sense?
Exactly, and thought bubbles are really good for that. They can, so like before when I showed you the woman in the shop buying food that was expensive, it kind of makes sense because you have the thought bubble going back to, you know, the port with the container ships. So it only really makes sense with that there. What about do people find it difficult to try and choose what to leave in and what to take out?
Yeah.
What about you guys? Yeah. How was that? Say a little bit about that.
For me, for my topic,
Yep.
because I talk about consumers and industries, so and social media.
Yeah.
I found it's easy to talk about social media because it use icons for social media.
Yeah.
You should you said I should to focus in one character.
I would say, and it's you were trying to like draw a process of like sustainability and consumers. I think it often in a comic works really well if you ground a process in a character, a person's experience, because it makes it a little bit more engaging in terms of it reads as more of a story. It's more like a narrative than that a person, individual character goes through the world and experiences these processes that you're talking about. You still learn about the processes, but it's through the experience of an individual character. What about yourself? You said you find it difficult to leave things out.
Yeah, it was because, like, for instance, the character that I wanted to show the experience for is like they are really frustrated at something, but it's not just one event that made them frustrated. And so I was like, okay, you can't like just choose one event, just one part of the data that led to their frustration. It was also a result of other things. So that's why I was like, how you choose each part to show here, because it wasn't just like one event that led to these things.
Could you have like each panel shows that each of those things that frustrates the person? Would you be able to do that? And then the final panel would be them just like, oh, you're not going to have the depth of information for each thing that frustrates them because you have to sacrifice some of the complexity. Or you can have one page for each thing that frustrates a person. But that's a really difficult thing in comics. You are stripping. You're trying to think, what do I really want to communicate here? And if frustration is the thing, and then it's multiple things that frustrate the person. Each panel could be a different frustration. I'm really conscious of time now. So one last thing is let everybody hear, like, who would you, if you were to create a comic, who is the person or the audience that you would like to be speaking to? Like, why comics? Who do you want to know about your research and why?
For me, it's like the people that have gone through the same sort of experience. I think they are alone on this planet, so they can kind of like see, okay, so maybe this is because this is the research output and shows like people with similar experiences.
Yeah.
And so they can kind of like relate to that. Okay, so there are people out there with the same issue.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like just showing people like visualizing people's experiences it can be really important for people that you're doing research with, and to create solidarity with other people. That's in my own research. When you create a comic and give it to people who are affected by disasters, it means a lot more than like an academic article you could ever write that they'll never read. Anybody else is like audiences? Yeah.
Probably policy makers.
Yeah.
And I think I'd probably be keen to, because some of the policies and guidelines for caregiving, for example, have imagery on it. So I'd kind of be keen for it to look quite similar, almost like they're translating it to us in that way, and give it back. So, well, this is what it kind of looks like in practice, but you're missing something, and this is the thing that you're missing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's more openness from what I hear from policymakers for using these different types of visual outputs, again because they're so time poor. Yeah, so I'm very mindful because we've got to an hour really, really quickly. But does anybody have any like last questions about the process of comics? I wasn't able to touch on everything there, to be honest. Yes, please.
I guess I'm really interested in like silent comics, silent graphic novels, and like more poetic responses. So maybe not as like didactic is really important for me. But then that makes me question who my audience is if it's connected to my research.
Yeah, the whole idea of like being didactic, like that's such a good point. So you don't want to make your research so that you're just funneling loads of information to the reader, really obviously, like it reads like a lesson with lots of text. That's the thing with comics. You want to avoid that by removing as much text as possible. Make sure the visuals drive the story and the speech bubbles and that, rather than it being very didactic. So people read it and actively learn from it. They use their imagination to unpack and understand the story. So comics, yeah, they're very good for that. Like, what was the second part of your question was about?
I feel like it was a useful question, but like I'm interested in like poetic responses and assumptions that aren't necessarily fully guided. But then that when you ask the question about who's my audience, that challenges me in terms of thinking who's going to engage with that as an output of my research.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Like, I don't think people think there would still be value in that. Absolutely. Even if it's a more poetic comic, less text based. Maybe it's not a bigger audience, but I guess that's what you've got to decide, isn't it? Who do you want to speak to, and do you have to compromise on the way that you might want the comic to be constructed in order that your intended audience can understand it? Yeah. Is there another question here?
Yeah, you just got me thinking about so many different things. So in terms of the audience, we were thinking about our audience is predominantly people with learning disabilities, and quite clearly they consume stuff with their carers, a lot of the time with family members.
Yeah.
So that kind of, is the target audience carers, family members?
Yeah.
Is it? So there's been some questions for us about that and how we kind of navigate that. My question specifically was about whether or not you had any ideas or advice around length of like comics.
Yeah.
Because we've played with the idea of having, almost like just a one page, kind of just to get, an idea across, or a few page, or either as a folded pamphlet, or is it a booklet, is it a story, it's all those sorts of questions. How long people then, what their attention spans are very different, and so on.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in academia now, there's a whole move towards storytelling, and storytelling is like really important way to communicate ideas. I personally think that you can't really communicate a story in one page.
Yeah.
Like I think you need a little bit more time to flesh out this narrative, and if you're doing something that's complex, looking at complex processes that you'll be doing in PhD researches, you need time to like develop that. Plus, you also allow the reader to get to know the characters a bit more. And Juliet Ford, she's the comics theory, she says that comics can develop this like empathy grounded in outrage. So you get outraged by what you're reading in the comic, and then maybe I don't know, want to instrumentalize comics, but it might mobilize some action. I don't think you can get that with a page, a single page. You get whole graphic novels that are like this thick.
Yes.
Maybe people don't have time for that. Mine have just tended to be like 22 pages maximum, and that's also it costs a lot to print.
Yeah.
If you don't have the funding for printing,
Yeah.
it can be tricky. Did you have a question?
I asked about if I would like to share, for example, in a seminar, can I make it this image as introduce for the audience? Is it fine to introduce them as a story?
An image of what?
The image of the comics and so for my topic.
Yeah, I
Can
think
I
so.
introduce it as the?
Yeah, people do like visual abstracts now. Have you heard of this? It's where, instead of text abstracts, they have a visualization like illustrated. Because you've got to remember that an image, like this image here, there's so many concepts and ideas embedded in it. It's like emotional labor of women, gendered migration, gendered responsibility of building disaster resilience, indigeneity. There's a lot of ideas in there which you could show, and then you could talk about it in your present. You could unpack it together. Yes, please.
How do you then, like, I mean, we can write the script, but how have you gone about like finding the person that then actually turns that into
The illustrator. Yeah, so I have these secret slides because sometimes these questions. If you have to go, please go. Like I know we've got over time. So there are different ways you can get an illustrator, right? You could get them who do digital or they hand draw it. And probably digital just means it's quicker to edit. But you could do an open call. You could put a thing on Facebook or other social media saying, I've got this project. I have this amount of money. Would you like to do it for me? This is the deadline. Or you could run a workshop. I did a workshop in the Solomon Islands. I had 30 youth artists, or they weren't all artists. I gave them 1-page sketch and we chose 4, and that's how we chose them. Another it was 2 months ago. I was in the Philippines. I went to the local university and I spoke to the campus director. I said, look, do you know any student artists who would work with me on comics? She said, I know 2, and she put me in contact with them. Or you could directly email somebody that you find on Instagram. There's all different ways you can do it. The budgets will vary astronomically. So you've got to be mindful of that. Somebody who's really experienced is going to be a lot more expensive. Like the 2 students in the Philippines, I went to them not really knowing the concept of what would be the right price. I said, how much would you charge for this? And they were like, oh, well, how much do you have? And I was like, well, I have 287 Australian dollars each. And they were like, yes. And that was like 4 or 5 times what they would normally get, which was so much lower than somebody who's based in London would be charging. So there are just different ways that you can find artists. But one thing I found is that a lot of like professional illustrators, they do a lot of commercial work, a lot of things for advertisers. So if you go to them with your project, in my experience, they're quite interested in it because it's a bit of a change from commercial work. And for 2 artists who are like professional, for that reason, they took a lower price because they didn't have the funds. They were happy to do it for the interest in the project. So yes.
Yeah, and again, a librarian question. Are there any issues with copyright and intellectual property?
We just do it Creative Commons. It's just
Okay.
like we just put it online. Anybody could download it for free and just use it. I think my old university were trying to make it so that only they owned it, and we got into a big fight about it. So I was like, no, it's Creative Commons. But it depends upon the unis. Yes.
My question is, I think this way is a wonderful way to illustrate and communicate conceptions, mechanisms, etc. But my question is, why don't you choose games or videos or films to do these things? Why don't you choose comics?
Yeah, because I like comics and I know I understand comics. I can't video, I have no idea. I don't know how to
A lot
create
of
them.
movies.
Yeah, a lot of movies, but I can't, I just don't have the skill set. And I think for me, it's not as accessible. I think a comic's more accessible because you can physically print it and give it to somebody. And they can just, maybe they throw it in the cupboard, but they might come across it.
The digital is
But I don't, in like,
usually just simple or
I think it gets lost. I think it gets lost in the internet. That's what I personally think. Like, if I was, more people have read the physical version of this comic than the digital because I've printed them and given them to schools. I do personally think that with people's maybe not attention spans, but I think there's something really beautiful about a physical comic that's quite short and anybody can understand it, from like an 8-year-old who just knows nothing about the masses to like a 7-year-old child in school. Like, whereas like a film, I don't know, I think maybe to sit there for like an hour and a half, not as many people would do it. Especially like in the Philippines where people have like limited internet access. They're gonna watch a film on their phone. Oh, I don't know. Yeah. But it's to just say there's still amazing ways to communicate research. I absolutely agree, but it's just not for me.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it an either or? So I think you've answered that. So have you ever been tempted with any of your comics to turn it into a film or some form of?
No, just because I don't know how to do it. Like comics, I feel comfortable with. Like I'm like, this is my thing now. I feel comfortable with it. But
making connections as well.
we should talk. And you can do the film and I'll do the comic. I think we've got to finish now. Sorry, we just got a call there. But thank you so much. I'm sorry that was the whistle stop. But if anybody has any questions, please do feel free to email. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I was going to bring some comics, but I didn't bring any with you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so if you want to have another drink or something, I think we still have time for that. And there is a seminar comes up as well, isn't there?
Yes, there's a seminar on February 4th. We will have longer, we'll have like more time to talk about these ideas. So really do come along. It's the same topic, but we're going to have other researchers from across the university who do different types of storytelling.
Now, if you want to find information about it just outside, you have like events printed, so you can just see it there and sign up.
Available what?
Thank you so much, everybody.